if we take the human being to actually be a complex creature, as you're presenting here in the paper, with both emotional and intellectual, then it always has to be for the human being. For it to be eudaimon, according to Cooper, it always has to be both moral and intellectual together, corresponding to emotional and intellectual. So book 10 for him, the distinction between primary and secondary senses, it is really only in the context of seeing man as just his theoretical intellect that it even makes sense to do. The idea of even calling anything, like calling a mixed life secondary, only makes sense in that context. Like you keep the conception of man as a complex being, and he would never say the primary sense is this, the secondary sense is that. It would make no sense to say that. So in that sense, yes. So I think there are two ways. So basically, what I think might be happening here is Pakaluk presents something like this. So it seems like Pakaluk comes here strongly with secondary and primary, or at least Sarah Brody, where even on the conception of human being as a complex being, we can discuss primary and secondary forms. And indeed, we can talk about primary being the contemplative life dominated by contemplation, and then this secondary one being primarily moral life. That's so in that sense, your position is more consistent with that approach, that interpretation, I think, than Cooper's. So I just wanted to hear your kind of thoughts on that.
Well, if I sort of like my intuition suggests
Mm-hmm.
that um, it's more of a like I quite like Cooper's approach of
Mm-hmm.
reconciling the two,
Mm-hmm.
and I think I I don't think that moral life is instrumental, so it's not like
Yes.
a provision for.
Yes.
So I
Mm-hmm.
was, I mean, there is this concept of leisure. So I would say that, I mean, if you allow yourself leisure either through the external sort of, luck, goods, whatever, wealth, health, and you have
Yes.
enough leisure time for yourself, you would be contemplating. But if you are
Uh-huh.
not, for example, if you're not that lucky, if you're not that
Yeah.
rich,
Yeah.
and you don't have that much of a leisure
Yes.
that you would devote to contemplation, I think
Mm-hmm.
it's absolutely eudaimon to live, the moral life
I
and
see.
have maybe just a bits and pieces of this contemplation,
Yes.
and I shouldn't sort of like sacrifice my life
Mm.
just to invest all in to get more of contemplation. So I kind of like the idea of avoiding this instrumental view that is only for the
Absolutely.
sake of. I would say that if you're lucky enough and you can just afford, enough leisure,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
would be great if you spend leisure in this way. On the other side, if you're lucky enough to have
Uh-huh.
lots of leisure and you're not contemplating, this is where I
Mm-hmm.
have sort of like an issue.
Oh, yes. Where it's, yeah, exactly. So,
So
okay. So now,
that's kind of my view, and
mm,
I have a gut feeling it's closer to Cooper's view
it is,
because it kind of like rejects the
but
pure dominant one. It,
yes.
it, it kind of says that okay, so leisure for me is almost a test um,
Aha.
to this whole system. So if you're lucky enough to have the one, then just
Yeah.
that would be where this hierarchy sort of like
Yeah.
comes through. But in all the rest, I would say you
Mm.
shouldn't do immoral things in order just to free
Oh,
up
yeah.
time for contemplation. So that's kind of where I stand. But again,
Mm-hmm.
it's very difficult just to reveal this through the text.
So here's a thought, actually, because this is where it starts. So here's a thought. As an interpretation of Aristotle, I think this kind of is a legitimate option to see the text this way together and tie it together the way you're presenting. Then, if you want to just keep it as is, like with in the same presentation, I would only then hesitate ascribing the whole thing to Cooper. Then be a bit more careful here in saying, I am now speaking of Cooper's interpretation holistically, and I'm incorporating every aspect of it. Because here is how I think Cooper would parse it out. He will say that what is meant by the contemplative life in Book 10, on the conception of man you are presupposing as a complex being, would not be eudaimon life. He would just deny it the status of eudaimonia, period. Because it in no way taps to who we are really. It treats us as if we're just intellects when we're more complex than that. And in that sense, the quote unquote contemplative life is actually a life, from Cooper's point of view, a life where one is not virtuous morally, one simply acts virtuously. Not because one is vicious, as he says, but because one transcends the whole paradigm of moral activity here. He sort of lives as gods do here, right? Where his self-conception is such that as far as acting in society or to provide for contemplation, sure, he will act in such a way that that will be done. But his motivation or how he will act, quote unquote, in a way that a moral person would, as far as form, the internal life of that individual is not going to be the same as in a virtuous person. Just because he is not actually possessing virtue per se, because to do that would require having literally different motivations and motivational structures. So that's the nuanced aspect. So for him, the moment you stick to your preferred conception, which I think is the right one, like I think that's the plausible one, that we are actually complex beings having both emotional and intellectual aspect essentially to who we are. On that view, Book 10's, according to Cooper, contemplative life is actually not just an option or desire, it's not even desirable for a human being. He would say you shouldn't desire it if who you really are, essentially, is this complex being, right? Because it's actually gonna not tap into what's essential to you then, which is
So
sort of
would
impediment in society and having that connection to other people in that way, and duties and obligations to others as well. Yeah, I'll pause here. Just want to.
so would you say that Cooper um, rejects, that's maybe a powerful word, but like what is Cooper's view on this, divine
Oh yeah.
parts of humans? So we are complex
Yes.
species,
Yes.
and by complex, the way I understand Cooper is the combinations of emotions and rationality. So
That's
that's
exactly
the
right.
complex.
Absolutely.
But where, but if we bring the divine element in, is it part of this complex meaning,
It
or
is.
it's something like separate? So because I think if you sort of take this divine element seriously, which I believe Aristotle did,
Oh yeah. Yeah.
then like where's the place for it?
Yes. Very good. Good point. He certainly takes it on board, and in a complex life, you still have um, the nous in you, the theoretical intellect in you, and the activity of the intellect is most godlike still, right? So as an activity, given the theology that gods, what they do actually as disembodied, not embedded in any social life and obligations, what they do is theorizing, and theorizing not practically, right, but actually literally theorizing, right? Not just reasoning. then the most godlike activity that we can engage in will be contemplation. And Cooper then, in a mixed life, even on a mixed conception of a human, and on the view where eudaimonia is a mixed life, he still prioritizes theoretical activity. Like, I think you handled that really well, prioritizes it still, even though in no way moral goals are inhibited or moral ends are suppressed or just made subservient. No, no, no. It's something like this. Maximize fully as much as you possibly can theorizing, because that is indeed, in some sense, the highest activity you could engage in. That still comes across strongly on Cooper's view of a mixed human being or being in a mixed life. But that's not to make this subservient to it merely, but it is still to recognize the demands of morality, so that only after you fulfill it, or only if you fulfill it, can this principle of maximization of theorizing be enacted.
Okay, so I
Does
should
that make
never
sense? So
sort
it's
of like,
still, yeah, so it's still prioritizing it pretty highly. It's just not saying this is the single good in which your eudaimonia consists anymore.
so maybe the point I'm struggling with
Mm-hmm.
understanding
Mm-hmm.
Cooper or
Yes.
interpreting Cooper
Mm-hmm.
is when it comes to leisure. So
Yes.
when I have this leisure time,
Yes.
other I can afford it. So it doesn't really matter how I got there. But let's say this is where I am.
Yes.
And sort of theorizing or wanting to theorize,
Yes.
would it be like not I would it's not like a vice, but so shall we prioritize theorizing at this point, or someone who says
Mm-hmm.
I have leisure time enough and I kind of feel that I should be devoting it to moral things rather than
Ah,
theory?
uh-huh.
Would that be a
Very,
problem for Cooper? He would say that it's your
mm-hmm.
time, it's leisure, both would make you eudaimon. So I mean,
Yeah.
just whatever your virtuous
Yeah.
heart sort of like calls for.
Yeah.
However, my point of view in this sort of context,
Yes.
you
Yes.
almost should uh,
Yes.
theorize.
Yes. So I think, yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. And I don't think he ever in the book pauses and focuses on this enough to know the details. So we can kind of think, okay, what would he say? Um, so let me just think out loud here. Um, he could say, as your hunch is, to say, no, no, you have leisure now. That's the time to just enjoy and do what gods do. They are at leisure, and that's what they're doing. So maybe then we need to, yes, so it would then have to be that one prioritizes theorizing in that moment to any other thing to do when one is free. And is So I think that makes sense. The only hesitation I have here is, again, we're already assuming there's no moral demand. So let's just already assume we're in no way, like, for example, it's not like your children, you have obligation to your children, or there is you should now actually play with your kids because they miss you. None of that is there. We're dealing with complete freedom now from all of that. You've done all of the other things perfectly well, dictates of morality perfectly well, and you've been a good parent, husband, citizen. But you have now 1 hour. What should you be doing? And yeah, when I put it this way, it seems obvious to me that Cooper's Cooper's interpretation or on Aristotle would say, of course, what else? Like that would be the highest thing you can do. It would be at this point to theorize. Yeah. So I would say that seems to me the most consistent, natural way. However, here is the only hesitation I have. Given our complexity as creatures, given that even theorizing takes its toll on our body to some extent, it's a particular way of being still, isn't it? Meaning
Yeah.
we are embodied human beings. Like, for example, we're not exercising necessarily, or maybe you can combine it, because Aristotle actually, interestingly, was known. His school was known as school where you walk and do the philosophy. So in that sense, interestingly, there's a way of combining straight away exercise and strengthening the body to some extent, and philosophizing. But still, the point might stand. You're at leisure. What if you just want to engage in a physical activity that you enjoy doing? Kind of your body desires that at that moment. Should you suppress that? Should you still say, no, 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 this is the time to act as gods do? I think there is an argument here to be had that given your complex nature, there may be times, even during quote unquote leisure periods, when you do need to almost honor the fact that your sort of long term, the best way is to be holistic here in terms of what you allow yourself to, like, where you tap into your nature a bit more, like not just the intellectual, but emotional as well. But then again, to what extent that takes into account the sense of leisure here again, because it again sounds like your body demands, your body needs something, there's a need-based thinking here potentially. And maybe at leisure, what we should understand by leisure is already something that's presupposing that's all taken care of. Now what do? Do you see what I'm saying? So
Well, I'm almost, itching, to bring the concept, which was not contemporary to Aristotle,
okay.
like the concept of free will. So that almost,
Oh yes.
calls, okay, so when there is this very moment where you are invited to take the decision,
Yes.
and
Yes.
so if we, from the modern view, sort of accept the existence of free will,
Mm-hmm.
so that should be almost, like we're not obliged to choose one over another.
I see.
So
That's an interesting question, actually. So yeah, no, um that's a good point. The question I have would be, so there will be some areas, even in Aristotle, the way we understand them, where certain options are really on par for a virtuous person at some point. There really is no longer the guidance of practical intellect to single-handed, almost like to action guiding, where there is a unique action that practical intellect says must be chosen. Instead, practical intellect guided you to the point where literally almost arbitrary choice is good at this point. Do whatever, like whatever feels like, just do, just act. So it kind of got you to, as opposed to just a single, and that's where virtuous ethics might have an advantage over other systems where the demand seems to be on utilitarianism. There is a single one action, always, in every case, unless, unless by some luck, really, which happens super rarely, the actual consequences of two actions for the history of the world, for the world is exactly the same. It's so improbable that almost always utilitarianism will tell you there is a uniquely best action. But Aristotle is not burdened by that. So indeed, there comes a point where you might just have a bunch of options. Just pick any book now that you desire to read, that explores something, right? Let's say, where you don't have the compulsion anymore, or practical intellect does not demand anything from you anymore. Yes, go ahead.
so the idea that just came up to my mind,
Mm-hmm.
actually, and like building on what you've just said,
Mm-hmm.
bringing up this concept of virtual ethics in general.
Oh yeah.
So I would say maybe interpreting this way,
Mm-hmm.
that this practical wisdom, sort of like the control center,
Yes.
which you sort of like train over period of your life, to the extent that is almost like automatic. So once
Exactly.
you sort of becoming this virtuous person, which is not
Hmm.
yet eudaimon, because eudaimon is almost like, that's the end. But at
Hmm.
some point of your life, you become virtuous.
Yes.
And my understanding of this becoming virtuous person, like
Yes.
once you are in this state, there is almost at this point there is no uh, choice. You're not
You do.
facing any choices. You're
Yes.
almost driven by this
Yes.
control center. You now need to
Yes.
choose. And theorize sorry us trying to sort of zoom in and see what should I choose. There
Yeah.
is no choice at this moment.
Right.
The virtuous person just acts, behaves, does
Uh-huh.
whatever
Uh-huh.
virtuous person would do.
Yes.
And we're not in the position of sort of putting this left or right.
Yeah. So yeah. No, that's good. I would say the aspect about automaticity sometimes would totally apply, sometimes not though, in the sense that because to engage in some activity still a practical endeavor, and there are always some new circumstances. So even though it feels like like it happens automatically, arguably there is still within the control center a judgment that has to take place. Even if you are not as an agent going through this intellectual inferencing. It's like there's now a mechanism of issuing judgment based on the formed character that have been developed.
Yeah.
And it happens as far as your agency goes, kind of almost underneath your radar, but the inferencing and the judgment still happens. Just like in driving, we're still actually judging like we're aware of our circumstances and we are making choices.
But the point i'm
Yeah,
the point i'm
yeah.
making, that this judgment is
Predetermined
happening under the
already by
radar.
under radar.
And I
Yeah.
sort of, as a virtuous person, I have this trust to this
Yes,
control center.
definitely.
Whatever it decides is good.
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
might, and we can be sort of, well, now reasoning, okay,
Hmm.
and predicting, thinking, okay, what
Yeah.
would this control center do in these sort of
Yes.
circumstances, in this context? Would it go for theorizing, or would that
Yeah.
go for exercising? So this
Yeah.
is like the question we're posing. But I would almost avoid this question, saying that it's almost like not really legitimate, because like
Mm.
only the virtuous person would know, or the control center of this virtuous person would know.
Yes.
And we are not in the position of sort of it's like
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
that's what I'm
Ah.
kind of trying to say, just almost insisting that this is not a legitimate question at this point, if we
Hmm.
are
Hmm.
standing on the position of this person being virtuous. If the person is yet to become virtuous,
That's
is
different.
it like developing its own character?
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
might be sort of zooming in
I, you
and
know,
like, yeah.
no, that's very good. I don't think we disagree here, Stas. I just think the fact that the virtuous person always aims in light of the knowledge at some level, in light of the knowledge of what the human good is. And if that human good is a mixed life, then at least in principle, your social being is affirmed as also legitimate to be the end, so to say, in what you do and choose to do. That is what opens up, at least in principle, the possibility that, quote unquote, and we need to discuss exactly what's meant by leisure, what is already presupposed not to be the case. But at least that's where my mind goes, that in some cases of quote unquote leisure, I could still imagine a practical judgment where it's absolutely fine to tap into the social aspect, even for somebody who's already formed as a virtuous person holistically, both morally and intellectually. But that is, so I'm sort of raising that as a still for me a possibility that can happen. where the
Is
practice,
so
yeah. But at the
so
center, let me just final thought, where I totally agree with you, and that has to be the implication. And maybe that's the main point here, because I'm going into nitty-gritty, like into the details, in the weeds. But the main thing is that if indeed in a mixed life, still theoretical activity is most godlike, and then being virtuous intellectually and being a complete human being in that sense would require almost having the right loves and the right tastes at this point. Determined, so you are already someone who'd prefer to theorize. There's already a kind of delight in that activity, which makes it the most delightful, the most desirable in a way. So in that, you're already predisposed, I think, on this view to see theorizing so as such a desirable, probably the most desirable godlike thing you could engage in. So in that sense, I think there may not be even a choice for in terms of what like for the person given that predisposition. But I'm just struggling with the thought that there is still another side of who I am essentially, which is social. And even though, yes, almost always the preference is theorizing, is it inconsistent with eudaimonia on a mixed view of life that just on occasion actually the preference will go to the social, or are we, you know what I mean? So it's the question still, can I imagine the virtuous person choosing something else to do at leisure than theorizing? And I'm sort of I wonder, I don't know. Cooper does not spend time on that, but I can imagine that. But then maybe what I'm imagining here is then the pushback. Maybe what I'm imagining is not really leisure properly so called. Because maybe what I'm imagining is I still have a need with respect to my body functioning well, or like I have a desire now out of the body because it has an exercise that I need to exercise or something like that.
well
And I
that
call
that
that
might
leisure in some sense, but it may not be in a fullest sense where it matters. But yeah. Mhm.
well that might put a lot of pressure on the concept of leisure. So it might be almost
Exactly. What do
impossible
we exactly?
to get there. So I yeah, I think that puts lots of strain on the
I
leisure
agree.
concept itself. So
I
I'm
agree.
just thinking uh, that almost like if we um, if there is a this like reasoning uh, on surface, like not
Uh-huh.
subconscious, like under the radar
Yeah. Yeah.
thing, like where this practical wisdom is sort of like deciding and in control. And
Mm-hmm.
I kind of almost have the trust that it should, choose whatever is the best for me, whatever is the virtuous person would do.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm
Mm-hmm.
not like even sort of, qualifying it in any way. I
Yes.
just have like all trust to this. What we
Mm-hmm.
are trying to do is actually bring this up to the surface and almost bring our awareness into this decision process and
Yes.
sort of and question it. And I think
Uh-huh.
that almost contradicts with what the virtuous person would do. So I would say, but you're posing the right question. So I imagine
Mm-hmm.
this virtuous
Mm-hmm.
person in this situation, and you're just curious
Yes.
what the decision of this
Mm-hmm.
practical wisdom would be. Would it go to the right or left,
Yeah.
theorizing or exercising? So it's just our curiosity.
Yes. Yes.
uh, and and I just think that yeah, we have reasons for both sort of
Yes.
ways. It almost feels like this theorizing is more delightful since that is
Yes.
godlike, and we
Yes.
have an intuition that it probably should go that way.
Yeah.
But if the decision, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
is different, I
Mm-hmm.
think we should trust this decision
I
and
agree.
say, well,
I
probably
agree
there was
there.
something under radar, there was some other complex things that we were not aware why it
Yeah.
chose
Yeah.
this and we should
Perfect.
just accept that.
I agree with that completely. So maybe then the only thing to add here, okay, yeah, I agree completely. The only thing I want to say here is that the fact that we are not virtuous to begin with ourselves now, and we're almost trying to do reverse engineering. We see the virtuous person do something, and then we're sort of imagining almost ourselves in that position, and the reasoning that would, like, what's behind the choice. There is, and in a sense, it's kind of improper to do, because we're thereby we're revealing ourselves not to be them, not to be virtuous with a character like that, to act the way they did exactly, which did not involve explicit inferences, perhaps, because it's just who they are at that point. I
Right.
do think, though, it's important to note that the fact that it is flowing out of who they are quite spontaneously at this point, effortlessly. Just like in our case, the fact that when I'm driving, I am making actions spontaneously and it's under my radar, does not mean that that action is not intelligible in terms of structures and reasons and goals. And there isn't an inner logic behind that, which we can, for the sake of convenience, explicate in terms of, oh, the reason why I indicated here is that I did not want to get in trouble, or to oblige with the requirements, or to honor the other road users. That is still a proper cashing out of the logic behind what my system holistically has issued at that point. Even if I was not explicitly as an agent thinking at that moment about obeying the authorities or helping others, it's just automatic as far as the agent goes. What I'm trying to say is we still consider what we do there, one, voluntary and intelligible activity. And for anyone who is rational, that also would mean that there is a structure behind that action, even though that action is voluntary and under the radar action as far as automaticity goes. There is still a logic. And so it's okay to ask, what's the logical structure of the action itself, even if there was no choice in the same sense of a agential choice happening, there's still a structured action with certain goals and reasons backing it up.
Well, that brings us like that at least like raises one or two questions on my side. So
Yes.
this is like epistemology, play
Yeah.
here. So like, do we have all the access and the completeness of the facts? Just
You don't.
to look into this intellectual process, and
Ah,
I mean.
we
I
don't.
think that we get into this infinite regress thing. So
Uh-huh.
so I would say that so there's this coherentism, speaking.
Yes.
So I mean there is a web
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
of things, and yeah. So I would say that it's legitimate, just to so to talk about these things.
Yes.
However, we should be conscious that there is like infinite number of facts,
Yeah.
datum,
Yeah, definitely.
and we could always be sort of like questioning that.
Yeah.
Okay, and there is another
Yes.
thing that also your reason. I mean,
Mhm.
the way you were talking this through raised another sort of question. So
Yes.
you were standing that we are not virtuous people, and
Mhm.
and I mean, and this is where you sort of like started, and
Mhm.
that brought this another question in my mind. So that almost sounds like virtuous person is also very difficult to reach, almost like
Yes.
godlike. So it almost like,
Mm.
so then what is the difference between the godlike and virtuous? It's almost
Uh-huh.
indistinguishable at this moment. So in my head it
Ah.
was like,
Mhm.
okay, common people,
Yes.
virtuous people, and godlike, but
Yes.
we're almost like bringing those two almost
Yeah.
together.
I
And
see.
can we distinguish those two then?
Yeah, that's great. I do think so. According to Cooper, absolutely, because gods are not virtuous morally. It's what he would say, because they don't have the kind of interest. See, virtuous action also requires emotional engagement of the right sort. You
Okay.
do it because you care for practical matters. You do it because you're attached to this human being, and you do it because you you ought to, given the obligations that exist in your polis. None of that at all would apply to the gods. So they literally are not virtuous, but they're neither are they vicious, because the category of vicious and vice morally it's almost like a
Right.
category error to apply to them. So to say that they're not virtuous does not mean they're vicious here necessarily.
Yeah, so the
Yeah,
morality is not like the
is not
dimension they operate in.
exactly, exactly. So the way I'm thinking of sort of, you say like it's very much close together. I agree with you in this sense. I think, like you say, there's this ideal of contemplation that may never be reached almost. Like at one point, you're saying that. And I do think there is a tension here between talking about eudaimonia as practicable good, achievable good, realizable through action good, which that way of putting it may be at odds with a little bit. So we need to be careful here how do we frame it. But in principle, I think it would be super rare, if at all possible, for humans to sort of have all that is needed for that kind of life, really. It's an elitist thing, 100%. It's a rare occasion, and then might be brought as a pushback against this conception, as you do. Like, is this elitist? Is this problematic? But I do think there is similarity indeed between what Aristotle understands to be holistic, like truly virtuous, because practical intellect, I think, if you have that practical intelligence, for Aristotle, it makes no sense to say you have it, and that determines the aspect of how you relate to danger, for example, and so you are courageous thereby. But it at the same time, it's possible not to be temperate while you have it. It's like if you have it, everything else is there. And in a sense, to find such holistically virtuous individual, according to the demands, I wouldn't know of many. So in that sense, it leads to similar issue of rarity. Even if we are not dealing with godlikeness perfectly, we're dealing just with perfectly moral being in this way, as far as always doing consistently the right thing in all of the domains of emotional, practical, social life. Then I don't know whether I've seen people like that exactly. Some approach it, but I haven't seen. So in that sense, there
I
would
have
be
a
a similar issue of rarity.
I have a question. I mean,
Yeah,
probably like you don't have the answer as I don't, but
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
just I'm curious.
yes.
What do you say? Uh, is it legitimate to say that a virtuous person is um, unconscious or not self-aware of of being virtuous? So there is no
Ah,
sort of like a reflection, like feedback loop that would sort of
uh-huh.
like give us, the uh, confirmation or confidence that we are virtuous. It's
Yeah,
again like very infinite that we are, even if we are, if some would say we are, this virtuous person probably would not say, because there is no
I see. It's almost a
measure.
sign of virtue. Right, right, right. That,
Yes.
yeah. Oh, that's a this is a deep question. I think though that Aristotle might have an answer in the book. See what you think of this, Stas. Although you and I have the right, I think the right, I would say, Christian intuition, where you go, hold on a second. Humility is a virtue, number one, and being self-conscious properly, or realizing that you are never actually you haven't achieved your fullest potential yet. Like you're still to grow. That consciousness, and even the distance between me and sort of, let's say, Christ as a paradigm, for most Christians, like almost like it means I'm not him yet. Every saint would say, I'm this. I see my sins all too clearly now, even better now than before, because now I'm at a different level of seeing the depth at which I need to fight it. I don't think Aristotle shows that kind of sensitivity necessarily. But what I think, so for example, in the discussion of the greatness of soul virtue, remember? There is this very strange virtue that by our lights, because of impact of Christianity, might actually to us look like this is just an arrogant jerk, where he assesses his own worth according to this virtue. The virtuous man knows his own worth and relates to others based on that worth. So, for example, he properly does not take seriously the feedback of people because he's like kind of aloof. He's not really almost, he's condescending at times, it seems. Like if you read the discussion Aristotle has of this virtue, we would maybe struggle from our intuitions to call it a virtue because it very much looks like you're arrogant guy. So the question of pride and self-assessment comes in here. I think for Aristotle, it seems like the virtuous person knows his own worth, not to have smallness of soul in the manner in which he engages with others. But that's where another question arises. To what extent the set of virtues Aristotle discusses are universally, objectively the virtues for a human being that isn't culturally tied? That raises that issue for us, because we now have seemingly different intuitions about that. That the ideal man for Aristotle might look like a prick to some extent to us now, because he looks down upon others in some sense. He thinks himself higher than them. And this superiority he's aware of, which is the reason why he doesn't take them seriously, their feedback or their views. So it very much looks like somebody who's aware of themselves as virtuous and loves it and acts in that sense for themselves, out of self-love, out of self-worth, he would act.
Yeah, that's again that makes me think or come back to this notion of what is eudaimonia
Yes.
in the way ancient Greeks saw that, the way Aristotle, of being ancient Greek, was seeing that.
Yes.
And there is one sort of criteria that is universal. And the conversation we've just had shows that this universality is I mean, we could challenge that due to different worldviews, different, I mean, like, can it be universal or universal with a caveat, you know?
That's a great, and that ties back to that question, remember, about the exam question, one single purpose and so on, that issue of, and actually your essay at the end, I thought, addresses some of that. So I thought, that's great. But here's the way to think about it. What is universal is that we all have rationality, animality. We all have certain constraints, biological constraints, and to some extent also psychic, as built upon biological constraints. And if you go with Aristotle's theology, we all have this spark of the divine in us or something like that, where it comes from the outside as a gift. But with an obligation, obviously, but it comes from the outside. So who we are becomes this like complex creature with certain endowments. And when we look at the Greeks or ourselves, we, to that extent, are all human in virtue of having that human nature, and that creates constraints. And that is the level at which we're dealing with something universal as far as constraints go on what is eudaimonia for us. But this is where you can introduce a kind of relativism that isn't threatening the deepest objectivity, meaning human nature kind of objectivity and that constraints. So here's the way to do it.
Humans, however,
relative. And this relativization, here's one way to do it. Precisely because we're dealing with, when it comes to our social nature and our emotional part, we are always dealing with embedded existence in some polis, in some social network. I could see the thought that depending on the form of life you embody, which characteristics and how to understand them, right? Which virtues become ways to flourish in that context, in the context of that society, with those norms, with that relation, with those expectations, then either what the virtue would demand in those circumstances, meaning we're keeping the virtue the same, but we're just saying what it would demand might be really different because of the circumstances. Or more radically, some ways, forms of life demand certain other characteristics as virtues. Certain other things become excellences here altogether. That the greatness of soul is no longer a virtue in a Christian society. I could see that happen because in a way, if you think about it, were you to act with a clear demarcation, I am the gold, like Plato would, they're gold, silver, bronze people, or like demarcation of women are actually inferior to me, which is what Aristotle seemingly thought about their intellectual life. And from his point of view, greatness of soul would involve that kind of judgment, for example. But so from our point of view, being that is actually not going to help you in society. Like society is not understanding that as a virtue. Society will think of it as a vice, right? Now, there is a question of how far does this reasoning go, in the sense that I don't think whether somebody is virtuous can be, you can put pressure from the mob on the virtuous person, right? That's not the point. That it's like as if they dictate which features become virtues. Rather, it's maybe this. In the context of this life, what in fact is contributing to human flourishing here? And I think in principle, you could say which things become virtues in all of the details and full generality might be adjusted depending on which form of life one embodies, so that not all of them are universal as virtues and those traits that you always have to possess. Maybe. But and in that sense, look at that. That's dictated by the form of life, not by the mob and their opinion, because they're ignorant. That's different. That's something else. But by the entire network, which includes living with people with particular cultural framework and views. And so, what becomes virtue for in that context might look different, and is determined though on the basis of the actual form of life here. So it's not up to your whim or just what you want it to be, like voluntaristic. It's determined by the context in which you live to that extent. So that could be a way to argue for relativism of sorts, which doesn't threaten objectivity on some important level. I'll say something, the final thing here, Stas, just as it's coming to me. For example, we see that in ethics anyway, in normal conversations. There's a distinction between absolutism in ethics and objectivism. Absolutism says, look at that, yeah. Absolutism says there is one action that is, let's say, always prohibited, never to be done, right? Or there's almost like a form of action that is just off limits, period, right? So that's kind of absolutism. Like there is an absolute demand that you always do that regardless of the circumstance. Most ethicists think if such things exist when it comes to actions, they must be super rare and very general, actually, things. Because we think sensitivity to context is super key. So instead of talking about absolutely right and absolutely wrong things, we talk about objectively right and objectively wrong. And invoking objectivity here is actually sensitive to context objectivity, meaning in these circumstances is there correct way to act. And then you look at that action and you go, well, that action can't just be plucked out of the circumstances and be put as the kind of action you do in all circumstances. On the contrary, the moral rightness here is predicated on it being in these circumstances what's morally right. So it becomes then what Kant would say, well, Kant is a bit tricky, but for example, for utilitarians and others, when it comes to sort of claiming that something is morally right, it's always claiming that something is morally right relative in these circumstances. That's part of it. So there is objectivity, and yes, there is a kind of relativization to context, which is fine. It doesn't threaten objectivity, because in those circumstances, is there a correct answer to question what ought to be done? Yeah, and so maybe something similar could be done for Aristotle, is what I'm trying to say. In this form of life, are there objectively virtues that make life flourish? And the answer might be yes, and it's not up to your opinion. But it's a kind of relativization, though, to a human life. And all of that is in the context of constraints anyway of who we are. But there is some wiggle room, depending on which form of life you embody, as to which sets of virtues become the virtues, the excellencies
So,
that a good man must possess.
I mean, we can then rephrase and say that eudaimonia is objectively achievable.
Yes. Yes, it must be for Aristotle, at least. I'm not, something that gives me pause is, given that you have to almost be morally perfect on the view, even relative to this form of life, say Greek life. The way he writes about it, Stas, it just sounds like, yes, it's achievable for a human, but almost like the way Nietzsche would talk about human achievement. Some human can achieve it. But is it open to vast majority of us? Given that,
Well,
that's a different question.
no, the way
Yeah.
you just discussed, you brought this, distinguished
Yeah.
absolutes and absolutism and objectivism.
Yeah.
I would say that eudaimonia is objectively achievable.
Yes. Yes.
With all the again different contexts. So it's what I'm trying to say.
Yes.
It's not the phrase that eudaimonia was objectively achievable to ancient Greeks.
Oh,
Yes, but
yes.
not necessarily. It's objectively achievable to modern.
Yes, definitely, definitely. On that sense, absolutely. Like I would, like Aristotle would say, precisely because the function argument could still be run.
Yeah.
And then the only thing then is whether his list of in detail, because some clearly will be relevant in all forms of life, probably ultimately because there can be no police or there can be no society unless one has some sense of loyalty to it. So, for example, I cannot imagine society which would ever value or praise cowardice. That is structurally impossible for society to sustain itself and promote cowardice and disloyalty. So any virtues in that list that he actually gives us, moral virtues, that has to do with a courage, straight, or temperance. I can't imagine ever temperance losing its status as the excellence. But my point is, I can imagine greatness of soul losing it. Not all of the virtues listed are perfectly sort of universal set that we can trust will be replicated today. But some will, and maybe some might need to be added, which weren't recognized at that time.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what sort of like modern context asks for, or so that's what makes it different.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Because we embody different forms of life. So I just want to say that here, what's important here is that not because we want to please people today, that would be that is not the right motivation for any virtuous person, pleasing the crowds. That certainly is not the right way. The mob doesn't, there is no general vote for what's good. It's the virtuous that are paradigms of good action anyway. But the form of life and its logic, its inner structure, is what is behind the virtuous persons having those virtues and not others. Yes. So it's not from the opinion of the masses in your society or culture in that crude way, but it is from a form of life you live as a virtuous person. That does impact which set in particular of excellencies are actually the set for a human being in this moment, in this social life. So I could at least see that kind of argument. and that kind of relativization to forms of life, um, and has been consistent with what Aristotle is doing.
Well, I find this conversation really, insightful and deep.
Yes.
So definitely helps to get deeper and deeper in understanding. I mean, it's so multi-layered
Gosh,
and
yeah.
fascinating. What fascinates me is that
Yeah.
it's kind of it's very difficult to get uh, onto this very depth without a sparring partner, someone
Ah,
just
yes,
to bounce those ideas to. And
totally.
I mean, you're doing fantastic job
Thank you.
because I mean that really makes me trigger provokes my thinking, and
Hmm.
those questions would never arise should you not bring those
Yeah.
ideas up.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the way to do philosophy, is exactly like what we're doing now. I think that, like, I would not have thought about leisure aspect the way you have presented it to me. It wasn't exactly on my mind like that. It was helpful for me to think, pose this question, because that creates that, it puts the right pressure for me. Okay, where do I think Cooper would go here? Which is not something I was thinking in those terms. So this was super helpful. It actually helps us to get through to the issue of how to think about maximization of theorizing according to Cooper once all the demands of morality are satisfied. Yeah. And it was such a useful way of entering into this question. So